Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of our Material History seminar series for 2025, the fashion cycle from retail to reuse. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building, and I'm delighted that you've been able to join us this afternoon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I thank them for their care of culture and of country and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. But I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations people who may be joining us today. Material Histories is a seminar series that is offered jointly by the Old Treasury Building, Deakin University, and the Australian Catholic University. And I'd especially like to acknowledge the wonderful co-curator of this series, Dr. Lorinda Kramer of Deakin University. In each discussion, we explore an aspect of material history through an object or a series of objects. And this particular seminar is offered as part of the PayPal Melbourne Fashion Festival's independent program. The seminars are open to anyone who's interested in material history, and we try to cast the subject net widely in terms of both time and place. So if you're interested in contributing at some point, please do get in touch. We'll pop some email addresses on the screen at the end of the seminar. Now, we have two fabulous speakers today, each of whom will speak for about 15 minutes. This will be followed by a short discussion between the speakers and then questions from you, our audience. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Dr. Nicole Davis. Nicole is an urban historian working in the museum and heritage sector with a particular interest in retail and business histories. Her PhD thesis focused on the social, economic and architectural history of Australia's 19th century shopping arcades and their place in the contemporary world. Her latest co-authored book is The Story of Melbourne's Lanes, Essential but Unplanned. And her paper today is entitled All the Latest Novelties, Modernity, Luxury and Consumer Desire in Australia's 19th century arcades. Over to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Margaret, and thanks for the invitation to speak today, especially with Laura, with whom I have lots of synergies and a great friendship as well. I'm coming to you today from the unceded lands of the Turrbal people of Meanjin, so I'm in Brisbane, and I want to acknowledge their elders past and present for their custody and curatorship of land. I also want to extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the countries on which I live, work, research and write about settler Australians. And that's pretty much the whole of this continent wide. And I extend my respects also to any Indigenous people who've joined us today. So this research came out of my PhD thesis, which I completed at the University of Melbourne a couple of years ago. It particularly draws on the fourth chapter, which focuses on the commodities available in Australia's 19th century arcades and also discusses how they were marketed. So much of this chapter was based on a case study of Melbourne's Eastern Arcade, and this site features heavily in this talk today. Some of the newer aspects of the research, though, particularly tracking trajectories of the lives and networks of owners of arcade businesses, is supported by a visiting fellowship from the Harry Gentle Resource Centre at Griffith University in Brisbane. So, influenced by European and British precursors, colonial Australian entrepreneurs enthusiastically adopted the arcade form as a retail and leisure site in the second half of the 19th century. These promenades were lined with shops behind whose plate glass windows were displayed a wealth of commodities. Lit from above, they featured all the latest in building materials that symbolised new technologies of the era. Iron and glass structural elements, gas and electric powered lights and lifts, encaustic and mosaic tile floors, ornate plasterwork and carved and local polished woods. From 1853, when the Queen's Arcade opened on Lonsdale Street, Melbourne, they were constructed in most capital cities as well as regional urban towns. The majority were in Melbourne and Sydney, with 9 and 8 respectively. 2 in Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide each, as well as examples in Ballarat and Bendigo in Victoria, Goulburn in New South Wales, and Charters Towers and Townsville in far north Queensland. In newspapers and other print media, these arcades were regularly associated with their counterparts across the globe, particularly those in the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and increasingly as the century wore on, the United States. This association was grounded in fact. The arcade's architecture was significantly influenced by international models, but often modified to suit the Australian climate or sensibilities, with unique colonial materials incorporated into the designs. Importantly, they made a significant contribution to a conception of Australian towns and cities as sophisticated, modern, civilised, and part of a broader story of a progressive colonial realm as expressed through the built environment. And I've written an article on this if you're interested in reading more. Arcades were retail and leisure centres where people of all classes gathered, shopped and worked. In the 19th century, the Australian arcades were marketed as dream worlds, not just of architectural civilization and progress, but where desire for exclusive commodities could also be indulged. The businesses within offered a diversity of products drawn from local, Australasian and global sources, with emphasis placed on consumer goods that had connotations of the luxury, modern, cosmopolitan and exotic. Advertisements for shops in the arcades emphasised these connections, and although I should stress such marketing was not restricted to businesses in the arcades, the association of these buildings with such ideas makes it a really useful site to explore 19th century retailing strategies, which we'll get a taste of today. These strategies usually began when the buildings were first constructed and advertising for the tenants. When Melbourne's Royal Arcade opened on the 2nd of May 1870, most of the 30 available tenancies in the building lined the promenade walkway and were occupied by retailers selling a variety of products. They and their wares were enumerated in newspapers throughout Australia, and they included things like clothing and accessories, picture frames, chocolates and sweets, photographs, musical instruments, wine, Indigenous cultural objects and books. One paper noticed that with the view of making the arcade a popular place of resort, the stalls have been leased to as many different trades as possible, with no crowding together of analogous businesses. This suggests that the building owners carefully curated the arcade's offerings to provide as great a variety as possible to maintain a broad customer base. 2 years later, and only 500 metres or 2 blocks away on Bourke Street from the Royal, we see a similar approach, but with a twist. At the Eastern Arcade, the owners tried to attract a diversity of businesses, but also decided not to let any of the shops to offensive businesses, such as butchers, fishmongers, greengrocers, etc., trying to retain the allure of its stores by avoiding everyday goods and potentially unpleasant smells. So written descriptions and illustrations in advertisements for arcade businesses and their wares presented an imagined discourse about the experience attainable within the buildings, driving the fetishization of consumer products and experiences. Such strategies aim to draw in clientele and provide them with all they needed under one roof, giving them, ideally, no reason to go elsewhere in the city. This Weekly Times article on Melbourne's Royal Arcade exemplified this and emphasised that customers could obtain garments of a fashionable cut, lay in a stock of jewellery and be photographed in all their splendour for their friends. These type of advertisements utilise laudatory language with repetitions of similar descriptors, emphasising characteristics of cosmopolitanism and progress, elegance and luxury, which echoed the descriptions of the buildings themselves. They not only served to attract customers, but were designed to entice the right sort of customers, a middle class or elite clientele, or at least those who might emulate their consumption habits and behaviours. They often provide a vision of the arcades as fashionable places for fashionable people to buy and do fashionable things in the hope of attracting just the same consumers. These ideas are also echoed in advertisements for consumer goods that could be purchased in the arcades. An 1895 ad for Stuart Dawson & Co. in the Strand in Sydney exemplifies such ideas, and they're not unlike something we might see today. So you see in this advertisement that their stock is described as new and beautiful, elegant novelties from leading makers, the latest London designs, and the most artistic site in Australia. Gaunt & Co. in Melbourne's Royal Arcade likewise advertised their jewellery and timepieces to emphasise their production in Britain or Europe and their up-to-date nature. In 1879, one of Gord's selling points for a September sale was his trip to Europe, where he intended to, quote, purchase new stock direct from the manufacturers, end quote. These beautiful earrings with Italian cameos in the Museum Victoria collection were imported by Gaunt, possibly after one of these trips. We see similar ideas in advertising for the London Millinery Store in Brisbane. In January 1886, Gertrude Rome, an 18-year-old English immigrant, opened this business in the newest fashionable shopping site in the city, Queen Street's Grand Arcade. Advertisements emphasised her up-to-the-minute offerings in the newest and most recherche styles, and the latest novelties in bonnets and hats, direct from London. An advertorial in one paper highlighted her choice bonnets ornamented with the now fashionable osprey, which gives a soft and graceful appearance. Alongside with the drawings of this headwear, these words promised a visual and descriptive feast for the customer, but also gave Gertrude's bona fides, having purportedly trained, quote, in one of the best London houses, end quote. The emphasis on visual spectacle and modernity of the pieces available, along with the arcade's architecture and design, created a space described by Walter Benjamin in the 1920s and 30s as the first consumer dream worlds, where commodities were reified and fetishized, and a consumer fantasy created. Benjamin's research and writing, though, ultimately was a critique of this dream world, which he saw as reinforcing the dislocations of modernity inherent in the iterative cycles of rebuilding physical urban spaces and the constant restocking of new fashion and commodities. But 19th century boosters and advertisers celebrated these ideas. One 1893 Christmas advertisement in Adelaide celebrated the cyclical nature of modernity, as symbolising progress and ingenuity, stating that, quote, the continual demand for something new is a powerful factor in stimulating the inventive energy of the people. Descriptions of arcade businesses indicate that commodities from all over the world were there for sale. They came not just from the perceived metropolitan centres of Britain, Europe, and America, but from global locations. The shops and wares detailed at the opening of Melbourne's Royal Arcade demonstrate this mix of local, colonial, imperial, and global goods. So we have places like the Parisian Millinery Depot, Giraud and Jasper's Australian and French Confectionery, a musical importer and colonial bird depot, the London Tea Company, the Royal Nursery Hawthorn, and Mr. Hart's Old Curiosity Shop for the sale of opossum rugs, furs, and native curiosities. Here we see a linking of Britain and Europe with these colonial spaces through the application of royal to various stores, for example. Associations with Europe were one of the ways in which these shops connoted luxury and sophistication, as well as good taste and civilized living. Advertisements and newspaper articles regularly emphasise these connections with international markets, whether through the origins of the proprietors, the source of the goods, or their following of European or American styles and fashion. We see the same in advertisements for La Maison Parisienne in the Strand Arcade in Sydney, which highlighted its imports from an association with England and the continent to give some added cachet. And I'll skip that quote and just let you have a read of it, but it basically says a lot of the same stuff that the other advertisements do. Advertisements for arcade businesses regularly stress their international networks. So Levy Brothers in Queen's Arcade in 1857 boasted of being, quote, in constant receipt of shipments direct from the manufacturers, one of the firm having gone to Europe for the express purpose of purchasing goods suitable for the colonies. Miss Rome of the Grand Arcade also leveraged such connections. As noted previously, she highlighted her training or supposed training at one of London's best houses, as well as her imports from Britain and France, such as a bonnet in the new Olivia shape, composed of rich cream Ottoman silk with a bunch of crimson Japanese poppies. And she notes that this is in a case that she's just received from London, ex-Bulimba, the ship Bulimba. Like many sellers, here she demonstrates her international supply chain, naming the ship on which her goods arrived and its origin. As the 19th century wore on, modernity and progress in Australia were increasingly associated with the United States and became a selling point for commodities. Businesses called the American bootmaker or the American novelty company might sell American goods or just trade on the associations of modernity that word America invoked. The Eastern Arcade's builder Hiram Crawford was originally from Massachusetts, and with his Civil War veteran brother, opened the American Novelty Company in the arcade, for which he imported significant quantities of goods from the United States. So, for example, in June 1990, in the newspaper, it said that the Brenda out of New York had arrived in Melbourne with 30 packages for them, quote, containing boys' velocipedes, tricycles, tally-hos, rocking horses, wagons, etc. And there's many ideas in the newspapers about the kind of modern things he was importing from America. It wasn't just imported goods that could boast such cachet. Local manufacturers' advertising language also imbued their products with the luxury and progress that those imported from Britain, Europe, and America might promise. In the Eastern Arcade, John Lewis, the agent for Walker's stoves manufactured on Latrobe Street, advertised his product as a cleaner, more efficient, and economical way to cook. New technologies such as these promised time saving and value for money were increasingly available and advertised in the late 19th and early 20th century. In the mid-1870s, Cecily Rowe, daughter of a landowning Euroa family, although in very straitened circumstances, expressed her desire for a labour-saving sewing machine like that of her sister. These machines were making their way into homes throughout Australia, and while still expensive, imported machines began appearing in shops and their advertising including in the arcades. In the Eastern Arcade again, the Canadian Little Wanza was advertised to be used by European royalty and English industrial schools and was touted in Melbourne newspapers as, quote, a sewing machine of great elegance and simplicity, end quote. From the same arcade in 1883, Mrs. Anderson of 6 Campbell Street, Collingwood, bought a sewing machine from the Standard Shuttle Sewing Machine Company of New York. Advertisements for the machine called it, quote, a marvel of perfection, the lady's favourite, has no equal, end quote, perhaps providing a strong enticement for a woman like Mrs. Anderson to purchase. For a woman in this working class Melbourne street, the machine costing £9 and 5 shillings was likely a very valuable investment. It was one that Mrs. Anderson spent over a year paying off on a time payment plan, and that little booklet down the bottom right records the payments that were made on that sewing machine over a year's time. There's much to say about the way that 19th century businesses, both in and outside the arcade, advertised and grew their business. Much of the language might be a little old-fashioned, but probably the hyperbole is familiar to us today from advertising and Instagram. But did these arcades live up to the hype? Well, some did. The Block and the Royal Arcades in Melbourne pretty much retain their allure to the present day. Others, such as the Eastern Arcade, which is why I found it such an interesting case study, fell prey to the vagaries of fashion. And although it opened in 1872, by 1899 it looked very different. In that year, the Bendigo Independent said, the community who tenant the Eastern Arcade comprise very peculiar people. In the arcade, one can buy anything from a dog to an astrologer's horoscope. There is also a nest of females in this interesting place who call themselves futurists, fortune tellers, clairvoyants, or whatever they like. And the Eastern never regained that reputation and closed in the 1920s. Thank you so much.
Nicole, thank you. That was such a great paper. Such a wonderful background, because I think in Melbourne we just love the arcades that we still have, don't we? They're such a feature of the city, and visiting them is still a pleasure, actually, isn't it? Just to wander and window shop. There's a couple of questions that have occurred to me. One, as you were speaking, how do the shops that are available in the arcades compare to what was available in the department stores, which are also sort of expanding at this time, aren't they? Are they similar, or are there great differences?
Well, the arcade had much more variety. I mean, it's hard to say because the department stores were usually owned by one person, and they either started off usually as draperies or ironmongeries. So they had quite a focus on certain things, whereas the arcade would have little contained shops, say, you know, a fancy goods store, or a chocolate shop. And like, to my mind, I'd like to go through the departments in the early department stores actually and compare that at some point. But they generally had a bit more variety, but they kind of had to, because the department stores were becoming popular as well and offering a lot of different options for people. So yes, so similar products, but kind of marketed and merchandised in a quite different way.
Right, that's really interesting. Now, I think we have, if we're reasonably quick, we do have a question from Sonia that's been put in the Q&A, Nicole, and she says, great presentation, thank you. The builders of the arcades would rely on people with disposable income as well as fashionable promenading, but how did they fare during the 1890s economic depression?
Not good. So the Eastern Arcade was pretty much, and I think this is where some of its downturn started. It was almost empty. It also needed a lot of repairs by 1893. So they looked beautiful, but they didn't last actually as long as they probably should have. And so yeah, the Eastern did quite poorly. It was very empty. The Grand Arcade in Brisbane was quite empty in the 1890s. Even the Block and the Royal kind of seemed to have struggled a bit to get tenants. But the Block had lots of offices, which always seemed to be doing kind of okay. So yeah, they didn't do great.
Yeah, interesting. Nicole, thank you so much. That was just
Thank
terrific.
you.
And we'll speak again later after we hear
Okay.
our next paper. So thank you so much. We'll move now to our second speaker, Dr. Laura Yotchit. Laura is a curator and historian with particular expertise in fashion and textiles. She completed her PhD at the University of Melbourne, investigating dress in Australian colonial society, and is interested in the materialities of surviving items of dress and their ability to shine a light on the complex histories of garments and dress practices. And her paper today is entitled Alterations as Evidence of Garment Life Cycles, Wedding Dress, 1875 and 1943. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, and thanks, Nick, for that great, very rich paper. And indeed, we do have overlaps with what we've been looking at, and that lovely time payment sewing machine from 1882 in Museum's Victoria collection we've discussed. So I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Bunurong peoples of the East Kulin Nations, that's in Stonington, Melbourne, and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. Today, I will be presenting on a wedding dress which was made for Alice Henty when she married John Heinsohn in Melbourne in 1875. And it was radically redesigned in 1943 when it was worn by 3 of her granddaughters for their weddings during World War II. The dress was donated to the Kew Historical Society in 2023, along with 44 other items of dress and accessories dating from 1842 to 1943, which were worn by Mary Ann Henty and her daughters and granddaughters. While I will discuss the history of the dress and its alterations, I will finish by addressing how we might think of such a radically altered garment today and its historical and material value, especially when faced with the criteria set out by the Collections Council of Australia in their Significance 2.0 for the assessment of the significance of an object or group of objects that prioritises intactness and integrity in relation to condition. I came across this dress in 2023 when I was engaged to write a significance assessment for the Henty costume collection, which had recently been donated to the Kew Historical Society. The 45 items in the collection have been kept and handed down through a branch of the Henty family, who were the first settlers, Europeans to settle in the Port Phillip district when brothers Edward and Francis moved their livestock across Bass Strait in 1834 and squatted on the traditional lands of the Gunditjmara Mara people in what became known as Portland Bay and the Western District of Victoria. The dress was originally made in 1875 when Alice Henty, who was the youngest daughter of Francis and Mary Ann Henty, married John Heinson on the 15th of April at Trinity Church, East Melbourne. Alice was born in 1852 and raised on the pastoral property Merino Downs, near current-day Casterton, which had been settled by the Hentys in 1837. In 1883, Alice and her husband went to live in the Italianate mansion Shrublands in Canterbury, which in 1924, after John's death, Alice bequeathed to the Anglican Church, and it became St John's Home for Boys. The 1875 photograph of Alice in her wedding outfit shows it had comprised a jacket bodice and full train skirt. In the mid-1870s, it was common for dresses to comprise a separate bodice and skirt, as was the case with Alice's wedding dress. Although the bodice bears no maker's label, its construction indicates that the dress was made by an expert dressmaker who finished the garment with fine detailing, including the exacting double rows of satin piping around the revers and cuffs that you can see here. The main fabric of the garment is a finely corded foul silk, which was referred to as Ottoman silk. Such a garment as Alice's would have been made by a professional dressmaker and perhaps one heading a dressmaking department of the well-known Melbourne stores Robertson and Moffat or Mowbray, Lush and Co. From the research I've been undertaking into the Henty women's letters in the State Library of Victoria, we know that they patronised both stores. There are surviving dresses from this period in collections that attest to the high level of dressmaking that these departments produced. Alice and John had 2 sons and 3 surviving daughters. Their youngest son, John Lawrence Henty Heinson, was born in 1883, and he married Grace Burland at St George's Church, Morven, on the 21st of August, 1912. It was their 3 daughters who were married in a remodelled version of Alice's wedding dress during World War II. The first to be married was the oldest, Alice Henty Heinson, who married Norman Tate at Holy Trinity Kew on Easter Saturday, the 24th of April, 1943. The Portland Guardian reported that the bride wore the Limerick lace veil, which had been worn by her great-grandmother, Mrs. Frances Henty, in 1842, with the white Ottoman silk bridal frock her grandmother, Mrs. John Heinson, had worn. The dress was worn again the following year by Margaret Henty Heinson when she married Dugald Matheson on the 12th of January, 1944 at St Paul's Church, Henty. Here I'd like to thank Margaret's daughter Anne, who I understand is in the audience today, for these photographs of her parents' wedding and for facilitating the previous photo of Alice. They are an invaluable visual source for understanding how the dress was worn. A report in the Argus stated that Margaret wore her great-grandmother's 102-year-old Limerick lace veil and, to quote, white Ottoman silk wedding dress, which belonged to the late Mrs. J. Heinson, her grandmother. 2 months later, on the 15th of March, Beth Henty Heinson, the middle sister, was described as wearing, again quote, a gown of ivory Ottoman silk, which was the wedding dress of her grandmother, the late Mrs. J. Heinson, when she married Sergeant Graham Anderson, also at St Paul's Church in Henty. We know from the surviving dress and the photographs that Alice's 1875 dress was remodelled, yet the reports speak of the dress as if it were unaltered. Perhaps the fact that it was had originally been the bride's grandmother's wedding dress was a significant point, and perhaps the reporters, without knowing otherwise, could not discern the difference in style of the current dress from the original. Of course, they wouldn't have seen the original photograph, but still, this dress here is a 1940s style. While the bodice, which was unlikely to fit the 3 sisters, survived intact, the skirt was cut up to create the 1940s style dress, with slightly squared shoulders, elbow-length sleeves, and crescent-shaped details at the bust. In line with construction techniques of the 1870s, the original skirt would have been lined and had a deep, stiffened, hand-stitched hem. The current skirt is unlined and has a fine machine sewn hem. Women marrying in Australia after June 1942 were faced with rationing, which severely restricted purchases of clothing. To assist the war effort, rationing of clothing and certain foodstuffs was introduced by the government and administered by the Rationing Commission. clothing was the first item to be rationed on the 12th of June 1942 and was not abolished until June 1948. When rationing was introduced, the Prime Minister John Curtin made it clear that making do with what one had was part of the war effort, stating, "The darning needle is a weapon of war these days." He was no doubt appealing to the domestic skills and ingenuity of the women of Australia, many of who would have weathered the depression of the 1930s, deploying such skills in the home. From June 1942, each adult was issued with an annual clothing ration card, like the one depicted here, that is in the collection of Museums Victoria. Adults were limited to 112 clothing coupons per year, and each item of clothing had a coupon value. For example, socks were 4 coupons and a man's suit 38. And as we can see here in the Grace Brothers advertisement of October 1942, the coupon value of the dresses was between 12 and 13. Just a week after the introduction of clothes rationing, the Daily Telegraph of Sydney ran this article with the headline-grabbing title, "Cannot Buy Wedding Dress," driving home the effects of rationing on a bride who was about to marry, if she hadn't already planned her wedding ensemble. It states, "Clothes rationing will prevent women being married in full bridal array before November the 15th. This is because purchase of a bridal gown," this is still part of the quote, "with train and veil, gloves, shoes, stockings and undergarments requires 77 coupons. The going away ensemble needs 31 more coupons. But the rationing scheme provides for only 56 coupons to be used before November the 15th. So this was part of the retail quotas that the government introduced to try and curb spending and prevent hoarding. So not to stop people just spending all their 112 coupons in one go. Australian women were exhorted to make do and mend as part of the austerity campaigns which were introduced during the war. In June 1941, Britain had introduced a similar campaign of extending the life of clothing when it had begun its rationing. Throughout the war, the Australian Women's Weekly provided fashion tips on how to economise when sewing new clothes or revamp clothing using fabric scraps in innovative ways. Contrasting yokes and playful patches were amongst these tips. The feature on head-turning hats, which provided, quote, "charming summer styles that you can make from odd pieces from your scrap box without using precious coupons," highlights domestic practices of home sewing and the saving of leftover fabric kept in the ubiquitous fabric stash to be put to good use in the future. In the wake of the bombing of Darwin in February 1942 and the threat on Sydney by Japanese midget submarines soon after, in May and June, these economising fashion tips, far from being frivolous, were part of the psychology of the home front war effort. Care taken in maintaining a pleasing and, in the case for women, a degree of femininity within the constraints of rationing and austerity measures was something women could step up to. An element of this strategy can be found in the Australian Women's Weekly's 1943 article, "It's the Loveliest Day of Your Life," written by their beauty expert, who urged prospective brides, no matter how much time they had to prepare, should make sure they attended to the feminine details to ensure those at the wedding ceremony come away saying, "She is the prettiest bride I ever saw." But what of the wedding dresses during the period? The above article depicts a bride in a delicate white or cream-coloured lace wedding dress, evoking the romance of the event. Wedding photographs and surviving dresses attest to the fact that many women did choose to and managed to arrange being married in the traditional full-length white wedding dress. Some borrowed dresses, such as that which had been originally worn by Lillian Judd in April 1939 in the Victorian town of Merrigum near Shepparton, and which was subsequently borrowed by 5 other women who married during the war. Others chose to wear a shorter, attractive day dress, which would have had ongoing use. Some had time to plan, and others married at short notice before their fiancé either departed for the front or was home on leave. This is the case with the couple on the right, Captain Ronald Christian and Yvonne Marceline Dickey Antoine, who were married in Perth in February 1943 when they were both on leave. A way around buying a wedding dress was to use one that was already in the family, as was the case with the Heinsohn sisters. Their grandmother's 1875 wedding dress and their great-grandmother's Limerick veil from 1842 were used by Alice, Margaret and Beth to create their own wedding day outfits. One wonders, given that the three weddings were within a year of each other, whether the sisters were all involved in deciding the fate of their grandmother's wedding dress and whether they made a collaborative decision about the style. Or was it that Alice, the first to be married, decided on the style and Margaret and Beth chose to wear the dress because of wartime restrictions and for the sentimental aspect that it was their great-grandmother's? Given that wartime engagements were not usually drawn out, it may have been the latter. Turning to the question of significance, which I raised at the start of this talk, is the question of how we might approach such a dress. As stated in their Significance 2.0, published in 2009, the Collections Council of Australia prioritises intactness and integrity when considering an object's condition. The guide states that, in general, an item in original condition is more significant than one that has been restored. This has an impact on how garments such as the Henty wedding dress, which has been radically altered or indeed made over, are viewed and whether they are accepted into collections. Current academic dress and material history is recognising the significance of altered and repurposed garments as evidence of life cycles and economic and social circumstances. In her book, The Study of Dress History, Lou Taylor discusses clothing condition and the value of altered clothes as, quote, a welcoming recognition of the cultural and social insights that such dress practices can give us. In addition, provenance and context play an important role in understanding the Henty wedding dress and how it came to be in its current form. Knowing the history of the garment from its creation in 1875 to its recreation in 1943 allows us an insight into the use and reuse of garments in this case of wartime austerity, and in this case of wartime austerity measures, and how three women within a family were able to be married in a dress that was to be worn for one day only during a time of clothing rationing. While we might feel a certain sense of loss for the original garment, which would no doubt have satisfied the criteria of aesthetic significance and met the conditions of intactness and integrity, we need to think about this garment in more complex ways that include the material evidence of clothing practices that have often been overlooked or have traditionally rendered garments less significant. Such a garment, which in its material form makes us stop and think, has the potential to stimulate new avenues of research. In this case, it is the atypical that prompts investigation. Finally, I'd like to end on the images to hand of the three brides, Alice Henty and her two granddaughters, Margaret and Alice Henty Heinsohn. The Heinsohn sisters' decision to alter and wear their grandmother's wedding dress some 70 years after she was married speaks of not only the wartime measures of austerity and ingenuity in clothing practices, but also of the personal and emotional value placed on such a dress, which have been kept and passed down in the family. Thank you.
Laura, thank you. That was just such a fascinating exploration of what you can learn when you look in great detail at an item. A quick question, when you first came across the dress, was the story with it? Or did you have to, it was, yeah, so you didn't have to try and work out how it came to be.
It was with it, but these photographs that I've recently been able to obtain through Anne, which is fantastic, just confirm how it was worn on the day, because the jacket bodice from the 1875 dress remains intact and came with the garment as a whole. And it has been displayed over the top of this dress, but now we can confirm that actually the jacket bodice wasn't part of these women's wedding day outfits, and that we see just this one-piece dress. Yeah.
Right. That explains it, because when I was looking at that photograph of the close-up of the bodice, it looked quite different from these. And my question then was going to be, in terms of dimensions, can you have an impression of the stature of the women over that space of time. But of course, if it's not the same bodice, then that
No, so it's
doesn't
the
apply.
jacket bodice that you'll see here on the left in 1875 as Alice Henty wears it. Has survived intact, and that was one of the earlier images I showed of that, and it's exquisitely made.
Yes, it looks
with the
beautiful.
fine double piping and the satin revers and cuffs, and you know, it's small, yeah. So I think this is why it was put to one side, and that there was the skirt, which is voluminous, and you know, I would need to, you know, there's value in revisiting these items and re-looking as to how the skirt itself was probably pulled apart and repurposed.
Yes. Yes. So do you have a sense of how much skill was involved in making over the dress in terms of dressmaking skill?
Yes, look, it's a fashionable silhouette, and but it's making and construction, which is in line with the time. You know, the lack of sort of linings and heavier construction is you know, is evident. And I do get a sense in looking at it, there was probably some, you know, manipulation of weight, maybe how it was cut out from the existing fabric.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Yes, it deserves more
And
close looking.
one of the other things which is interesting in thinking about dress construction and things in the past is the width of fabric, isn't it? Which we used to particular widths, which have sort of become standard, but I think that was not the case in the 19th century, was it?
Oh, there were standard widths for silks. You know, a common one is from the top of my head, like a 24-inch width. And when I was doing my research for my thesis, when I was looking at garments, I did actually take an approximate width length that you could see was evident in skirts, where they used the whole width and then probably pleated into the waistband. But I was interested in recording what the width lengths were, not because I was going down that rabbit hole now to do with, but while I was there to capture, yeah, how wide these fabrics were.
Yes. And what did you conclude?
For the width lengths?
Mm.
Look, there were common width lengths, and I'm sure there would probably have been work done, I'm sure, in Britain and I expect in France, within archives of perhaps, you know, silk manufacturers, where there would be more information available about that, and people
Yes.
have done work on weaving, yeah, manufacturing.
Fascinating. Because if you're thinking about how much dress material was used, the width of the fabric presumably had a bearing on those sorts of calculations too, didn't it?
Yes. So I was often taking not just the width of the fabric, but then how many drops, as I call them,
Yes.
that were combined into a skirt, for instance.
Yes, yes, indeed. So a skirt of the 1870s, for example, any idea how much?
Might have had about 7. 7 was a
About
common
7 yards. Okay.
Yeah.
Of
Not
the
yards, widths of the
yeah.
going around. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Now I should invite Nicole to join us again. This is the point at which we ask our two speakers if there's a particular question that occurs to them from the presentation of the other paper that they would like to raise, or a comment that occurs to them across the two terrific presentations today. So Nicole and Laura, does anything
I
occur
have
to you?
like a big list.
We like a
What's
little
the
list.
burning question? Laura and I have talked a lot about significance and changing both buildings and other material culture objects. So I'll leave that. But one thing that did occur to me, Laura, can you tell us if there are any oral histories or letters or things that talk about this remaking, like either in the 19th century or later?
Yeah, it's you know, as you dive into a cache of into the archives and like the Henty women's letters that I've really only scratched the surface with, but I've done some very deep work 1890s because of a run of letters between the Louisa, so Mary Ann's daughters, yeah, particularly Louisa and Caroline. Louisa living at Field Place in Kew, and Caroline on the property Merino Downs in the Western Districts. And so there's narratives that run across those letters, for instance, in the late 19th century, where there's discussion about making. In their case, it seemed to be going to a dressmaker and having a garment altered and something happening to it. So I try and find these gems and, you know, then put them into documents, e-folders of going, oh, look, yes, that's seeing a pattern of happening across letters when you're reading them and other gems that you find. But yes, there is a lot of things, for instance, in those households that's going on in relation to dress. Some of it's buying off ready-mades like mantles from Robertson and Moffat, and then going to dressmakers and then also having things altered and making children's clothes in particular in the home.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, I've just started scratching the surface of those letters that I've been reading, and they also don't say a lot sometimes. You know, they don't give you the detail that you'd like to know. So what did you actually do when you did that to that dress, or that, you know, when you were making the servants' clothes, or whatever you were doing, you know?
I know, tantalizing bits. I've got a little
Yeah.
favorite pet project, which is swatches in the archives. And
Oh, yeah.
sometimes they say almost zero about their dress, but the fabrics are there. And they just say, I'm sending you my patterns for the dresses.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. And you don't get the pattern or the newspaper article or whatever they're trying to send. That doesn't survive. Just the note that we're sending you this in this letter. It's very frustrating.
I wish they'd done a sketch.
Yeah.
Now we have a question in the Q&A from Deb Tart-Smith, and it's really I suppose addressed to you, Nicole, but to either of you really. I'm interested in the gender targeting of arcade marketing. There seems from your presentation to be a focus on women as consumers. Can you reflect on this, please, Nicole?
Absolutely. Thank you, Deb. And thank you so much. I meant to say in my talk, Deb went above and beyond to get the sewing machine photographed for me for this talk. So thank you so much for that. That was amazing. And it's something Laura and I talked about for a very long time, that sewing machine, and we never have seen it until now. So that's exciting. Yeah, absolutely. And I actually argue against this in my thesis, but I think it's just the quotes I chose for this presentation seem quite female or women, to be aimed at women. I think that, and I can show that, I think that there was actually just as much advertising for men to be fashionable or to buy fashionable things for their belles or, you know, girlfriends or wives, etc. But also for fashionable tailoring and good sartorial practice in Melbourne particularly, and Sydney, in this advertising. And there's certainly in some arcades there were just as many shops for men as there were for women's goods and objects. So yeah, it's this is the discourse that arcades are just women's spaces, but I completely disagreed with that in my thesis.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Now we have a couple more questions here. One from Erin, who says, how much influence would wealthy families such as the Henty family have had on fashion trends in regional areas?
Yes, important, and particularly earlier on, by the late 19th century, goods are going backwards and forwards between the two family properties, Melbourne and Western Victoria within a day, quickly. But it's one of the arguments in my thesis is rural areas. We have to think about this trope, this idea that people just weren't fashionable in Australia, and we have to think about centres or nodes within how fashion was disseminated through cities like Melbourne and Sydney, but then major regional centres like Ballarat, and well-populated areas, and then out from there. But one of the things is certainly on properties where there were many people living on these properties and stations. So they might have been remote, for instance, from centres like Melbourne and Sydney, but within their own world where there could be a couple of hundred people living on properties. And I was looking at this in particular with the Springfield Faithful collection that's in the National Museum in Canberra that came in, and there's a number of garments, a bit like the Henty collection across decades, worn by women of the family. And when you see those garments, then you have to think about how they were accessing the latest fashions with trips to Sydney, and also being able to order and then bringing them into their own region, and then within the property itself with people living there, and also their social outings within that region, how fashion was disseminated through a family like that.
A mail order catalogue is important.
Yes, and self-measurement forms are a part of that. I think it's just interesting to think about what they may have actually been ordering of a better quality, and maybe a preference to make a twice yearly trip to a dressmaker in Melbourne or Sydney. Rachel Henning's letters gives you a bit of an indication of that, like in the 1870s, where she goes to Sydney to buy up what she needs, and actually goes to farmers and says, what a wonderful store, I can get everything here. Same sort of quote like the arcades, Nick, saying, I can get everything here.
Yeah.
Yes. Gosh, we've got lots and lots of questions coming, so we might have to be very quick. One from Sonia saying that the great presentation, story's great. Wedding dresses, I assume, are always easier to research because they're associated with milestone events. What other clues are there on garments to indicate the life of the wearer? Follow-up question, was there a black market in clothing coupons? Well, I can probably answer that one and just say, yes, there was, but you had to be brave. So, Laura, the first question.
Yeah, evidence of other types of wear and tear, of course, mending and alterations where you can see it's been let out or a piece put in. That there's certainly that's happened with one of Alice Henty's garments, which I think was probably part of her trousseau, a pink one, that there's been later on a contrasting pink fabric's been put in to let it out, because what actually the family did do was they did wear them to events, and were photographed too, like in the early 30s, in Table Talk, for instance, wearing Mary Ann's 1842 wedding dress with the veil, and sort of celebrations and things like that, and fundraising for the Red Cross, historical clothing. And as you say, with the black market in the coupons, yes, and you've written in this area, but there was a black market and there were quite hefty fines.
There were. But also families, I think, often would combine coupons, wouldn't they, for things like weddings, so that people could manage to buy fabric and things. Now, just if we can be very quick, there's a very interesting question from Linda Young here. Shopping in arcades was surely a further step in taking women into the public sphere. It must have made even the department store seem private. I wonder if and when the arcades began to offer cafes or tea rooms, and if they offered public toilets.
Thank you, Linda. That's such a great question. Yes, there were many tea rooms, restaurants, cafes. I guess the Hopeton tea rooms in the Block Arcade is probably one of the best known, but even in 1853, the Queen's Arcade had places you could eat and drink, and they became generally a feature of every single arcade. So there would often be a restaurant and a tea room. So there were some divided and gendered spaces, but then there were also eating and drinking places where men and women could dine together. Toilets, yes. I haven't ever found the plans for the Queen's Arcade. Not sure they exist, but there certainly were in most arcades. There were toilets that the customers could use. And so for women, this was a really enormous step to be able to use toilets where, where they didn't have them in public, which is a question that quite a few people have talked about. Didn't really happen until the early 19th century, early 20th century. So, yeah.
Which seems extraordinary, doesn't it? But there you go.
Yeah.
And now we also have a question in here, which I might allow each of you perhaps to answer at the end of this. We can keep a copy of all the questions, and it concerns, someone said she has a couple of her grandmother's undergarments from the 1890s. Is there anywhere that she can take them, or he or she can take them, to be included in a historical collection? Now, there are all sorts of options there, so I might leave it, if you'd be prepared to perhaps answer that afterwards, and we can pop that into the recording for the person who asked that question.
Sure.
Now, I fear time's up for today, 1:59, gosh. So can I just repeat my thanks to our two fabulous speakers today, Nicole Davis and Laura Yotchit. I think you'll agree that we had two really engrossing papers, and that's indicated in the number of questions that we have there. I hope we managed to get through them for you. I'd also like to thank the team behind Material Histories, Dr. Lorinda Kramer and her colleagues at Deakin University, Katie Dunning at the Old Treasury Building, who manages all the tech expertly, and our colleagues at the Australian Catholic University. A special thanks also to you, our audience. Thank you for joining us and for all your terrific questions. Now, the next seminar in the Material History series will be held at the same time on Friday, the 16th of May, on a very different topic, Objects of Connection, the Overland Telegraph. Remember that if you have a paper you'd like to present in this series, we welcome submissions. You'll find the details on the Material Histories page on the Old Treasury Building website, and please don't be shy. So thank you very much, everyone, and good afternoon.